Okay, you can hear me, can you?
Yes, and people might like to put their view on speaker view. It's maybe the best speaker view. I'll do that. Yeah.
Sorry. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Slideshow.
Yes, it go right.
Yeah, grand.
Yeah.
Listen, we'll get going then, and thank you very much for those very kind, elaborate words of introduction, Betty. Listen, it's just a great pleasure to be speaking to Cork. My only preference would be to be speaking in Cork, but we can't have that. We can't have it every way. And do feel free to recharge your coffee cup or wine glass, as the case may be. So the question is, who was this chap, Thomas Weaver? Well, he was one of several 19th century geologist engineers who served Ireland extremely well through his mine operations and his geological mapping. And I first met him when I worked at AVOCA mine back in the 1970s. And my fascination with him has proved enduring. Indeed, a few years ago, Liffey Press kindly published my biography of him, and that fascination is captured in the title, Dissenting Spirit. I think you can see it on the screen there. And when I mentioned it to a friend, he replied, "I didn't know you were into Presbyterian whiskey." Think about that one. Anyway, I need to remind you that I'm not an historian, I'm a retired geologist. So that's important to say, but I won't mention too many dates as we go along. You just might like to remember one, and that is that Thomas Weaver was born in 1773. Now, he was an Englishman born in the city of Gloucester, famed for its Gothic cathedral, which does feature in some Harry Potter movies. But then again, the racegoers among you will probably recognize Gloucester is just down the road from Cheltenham, and that may be more attractive. When Thomas was still a teenager, the family business was favored with a royal visit from King George III, a man whose mental health would sadly soon deteriorate quite drastically. Although perhaps I should say it wasn't as a result of his Gloucester visit. Now, Britain at that time produced 75% of the world's copper, and that was the raw material for the family business, which was pin making. Yes, pin making. Now, this was no trivial industry. It employed 1,500 people in Gloucester at that time. And the economist Adam Smith highlighted the industry when he demonstrated that by an appropriate division of labor, its productivity could be improved 200-fold. Imagine that. And if you happen to find yourself in Gloucester, you will delight its citizens if you point out that the bollards in the city centre are pin-shaped in homage to this industry. So pins were to Gloucester what pints were once to Cork, if I'm correct. Now, copper ore for the family business was actually sourced here in Ireland in the Vale of Avoca, but it was quite possible that new and alternative sources of ore would be needed in the future, and that was the motivation for the family to send young Thomas off to study mining and geology. Now, that was a very sensible decision, a very good decision, wise. What was remarkable was his destination, which was Freiberg, located in distant Germany, close to its border with the Czech Republic in modern terms. And you should distinguish that from Freiberg, which is the larger city. It's on the opposite side of Germany and the Black Forest. So we're over on the Czech border, and it was an extraordinary decision. After all, Thomas could have gone and received excellent geological training at, say, Edinburgh or Oxford, but Freiberg had one of Europe's best-known mining academies, established to serve the needs of the nearby metal mines. And furthermore, its professor of geology, which we show here, Abraham Werner, he was one of the leading lights of European geology and mineralogy. He attracted students from all over Europe, and indeed, among Weaver's contemporaries would be Alexander von Humboldt and Leopold von Buch, two men who would be outstanding scientists in their own right later on in their careers. But it's kind of popular now to mock Werner for some of his more fanciful ideas, such as deriving volcanoes from the combustion of underground coal seams. But in fact, in fairness, he was a truly accomplished scientist, one of the first to insist on using an evidence-based approach to research. And, you know, his influence will be behind many of the geological developments we're going to discuss tonight, in fact. And indeed, he is credited with putting mineralogy on a scientific basis. And that was so important for the future, not alone of mining, but of metallurgy as well. So a very important person. Now, if you travel south along the Vale of AVOCA, CRONEBANE will appear on its eastern slopes, that is on the left-hand side of this image. And that was Weaver's destination when he arrived there, aged just 20 years of age. And he took up the management of what was a loss-making operation. And over the next 20 years, he made an outstanding success of things. He increased production. He found a new source of ore, a new ore zone. This was pyrite-rich copper ore. He was a very committed manager, committed to safe working and to good industrial relations, practices that weren't universal, we all know at that time. Now, the ore was mined from underground by self-managed partnerships. That was the typical way at the time. And the partnerships were paid on the basis of ore delivered on surface. And that ore was then exported to Britain for smelting. Now, by modern standards, the production would have been fairly low, of the order of 2,000 or 2,500 tons per year. Now, the modern Navan zinc mine would produce that within a day, probably in a single shift. But of course, the CRONEBANE ore was actually very valuable. It was very selectively mined, and it would have been about, the copper content would have been about 10 times that of AVOCA operations in the 20th century. So this was valuable stuff. Now, CRONEBANE became a household name during Weaver's tenure at the mine because of this coin, the CRONEBANE halfpenny, which became the common copper coinage in Ireland of the day. And the coin collectors among you will realize the history and significance of the coin. Now, the image we see here is of St. Patrick, who has a long association with both AVOCA and its miners. But Weaver's boss, and indeed his mentor at AVOCA, was a man called Abraham Mills, who was responsible for administrative matters at the mine. And they shared a similar background. They were both wealthy British Protestants with strong scientific interests. And they they formed a very good partnership between them. They worked the mine very effectively. And in fact, it was only many, many years later in 1808, when there was a collapse in the price of copper, that the end was in sight for CRONEBANE operation, and indeed for Weaver's residence there. So he was gone by around about 1812. But of course, it really was a very significant success he had there. Now, it was Mills and himself who secured a very lucrative government contract to manage the placer gold workings that occurred nearby at Woodenbridge. And they did this in partnership with the magistrate up in Rathdrum, Thomas King. And there had been a chaotic gold rush here in 1795. And in one glorious month, several hundred diggers recovered at least 80 kilos of gold, including this 22-ounce nugget that you see here on the left-hand side. But Weaver's operation was a lot different. It was an early example of a well-managed mine, and you can see it on the right-hand side there in that picture, a celebrated lithograph. He worked it thoroughly, and he also executed a well-thought-out exploration program designed to seek the mother lode of the gold. And his program was publicly endorsed by none other than Richard Kirwan, who was Ireland's most celebrated scientist of his day. Now, the program involved opening trenches, deep trenches, a radial pattern of them around the valley, and indeed a couple of short tunnels as well. The expectation was, of course, that the bedrock gold would be found in some of the many quartz veins in the bedrock. Alas, that was not to be. No gold was found. And this, together with the steady decline in the amount of gold they recovered, led the government to terminate the workings around about 1809. And a couple of years later, the Vigilant Treasury up in Dublin Castle undertook an investigation to see if there had been any gold embezzlement during the operation. And actually, they decided that there hadn't been any. And yet, there was just a little bit of suspicion about one supervisor who resigned abruptly and left for America with unseemly haste. I don't know if he's over there near you, Renee, but he did make off with some gold, I suspect. In any event, Weaver lived a fairly comfortable life as a member of Wicklow's Protestant ascendancy. And at the same time, he can't have felt very comfortable in the unsettled political climate of the 1790s there. Indeed, Mills and himself were the senior officers in the CRONEBANE yeomanry, and they worked in collaboration with their friend Tom King and his Rathdrum yeomanry. Now, the CRONEBANE yeomanry was composed of loyal miners committed and determined to protect their mine and its largely Protestant community. And the loyalty and courage of Weaver and Mills were tested in the 1798 rebellion, and indeed they were proven. Now, of course, we know the main hostilities took place south of AVOCA, down in County Wexford. But operations at AVOCA ceased for several months during the uprising, as the focus went exclusively on local security. And indeed, when the rebels surrendered, a lot of them sought refuge in the mountains up north and northwest of AVOCA. And of course, Mills and Weaver, they were tough men. They never shirked their military duty, and they pursued these rebels on every occasion. And indeed, to be blunt, they were well rewarded by the company afterwards for their efforts. Now, peace was quickly restored to the district, and yet the company felt it prudent to maintain the yeomanry in existence for the remaining life of the mine. So there was obviously a degree of risk there. But on the 200th anniversary of the Rising, the Royal Irish Academy published a volume on the practice of science and engineering in Ireland at that time. And you will search its many pages in vain for a single reference to our friend Thomas. Indeed, I have been gently chided on occasion for having studied someone who took the winning part in our revered revolution. And so I ask you, are we really open to the achievements of a British engineer and geologist? Indeed, I challenge us all to think about that a little bit. Now, it's 1812. Weaver has left CRONEBANE. He's nearly 40. He's out of a job, but he has the experience and indeed the wealth to explore new career opportunities. He might have thought of an academic career, but then the only university in Ireland, Trinity, wouldn't appoint a professor of geology for another 30 years. But lo and behold, at this very moment, the RDS advertised a very attractive position as mining engineer with the aim of stimulating mine operations across Ireland. And of course, with 20 successful years under his belt, Weaver must have felt he was in a very good position to get this post, and he might have been just a little bit surprised to find that he had been beaten to it by this man, Richard Griffith, someone who is familiar to many of you. We see him here in his later life when he was very famous for his Richard's valuation, which people will be familiar with who are interested in geology or have had any dealings with property registration. But of course, the geological community know him for his monumental geological map of Ireland. But back in 1812, he was still a relatively inexperienced geologist. He hadn't anything like the same experience as Weaver, who might have been justified in feeling disadvantaged in this competition, and perhaps by his English birth. But in any event, these two men, Griffith and Weaver, would become long-term and sometimes bitter rivals, not in mining, but as we'll see, in geological mapping. Now, despite that setback, Weaver was entering one of the more productive phases in his career. He was now the driving force behind these Wicklow lead mines that are situated in the mountainous terrain around Glenmalure and Glendalough. Now, lead mines were easier to work because, unlike copper, the ore could be smelted on site, and the metal, the lead metal and the byproduct silver could be sold locally in Dublin. He worked these mines successfully for many years. He really did. He was quite a success down there in Wicklow. And not alone that, but in parallel, he began to undertake geological mapping, starting around the mines that he was working and spreading outwards, so that by about 1819, he had covered 1/3 of the country in southeast and eastern Ireland. Now, this was a major endeavor. Of course, at that time, geological mapping was an innovative technique. It was not a novel technique, and it was yielding great insights into the history of our planet and indeed the evolution of its biodiversity. And Weaver was gaining quite a reputation himself at this time. He was a successful mining engineer, and on the scientific side, he had published some papers on the Wicklow gold. He had also translated and updated Werner's classic mineralogy textbook. It was the first in the English language. So he was quite a personality in the Irish scientific community at that time. And now he would copper fasten his reputation. Oh my God, that's a terrible pun, sorry. By publishing the work on his mapping of Eastern and Southeastern Ireland, in which he would have many, many innovations and new insights. And of course, when I first met him, the one that took my fancy was his interpretation of the copper ores at AVOCA, and he interpreted them as chemical sediments. These days we'd refer to them as sedimentary sulfides. And of course, it took us 150 years to realize that Weaver was absolutely correct. Now, geology was a much more popular subject then than now, and partly because travelers sought to understand the many interesting landscapes they encountered along the way, such as the Giant's Causeway that we see here. But of course, more than that, geology was experiencing a revolution on the scale of that which engulfed it again in the second half of the 20th century. And I'm referring here to plate tectonics. But the earlier revolution was just as exciting, and one of the key arguments related to the origin of various rock types. And the prevailing theory at that time was called Neptunism. That was the notion that pretty well all rock types, apart from sandstone and shale, originated as chemical sediments precipitated on the floor of a hot and primitive ocean. Now, it wasn't based on a great deal of field evidence, and gradually it was superseded by an alternative, which became known as volcanism. And as the name implies, of course, it held that igneous rocks such as granite and basalt originated by cooling from molten magma. And and of course, that's an interpretation held today. But the struggle between the two theories, Neptunism versus volcanism, was prolonged and strident. And indeed, the Giant's Causeway we see here featured quite prominently in the international debate. Now, it's fair to say that around 1820, a majority of geologists in Britain and Ireland, including Weaver, would have been Neptunists. And for example, Weaver would have interpreted the Wicklow granite as sedimentary on the basis that in Glenmalure, granite and schist were interlayered with each other. Now, of course, in the succeeding decades, the vast majority of geologists became convinced with the increasingly compelling evidence regarding volcanism. But I have to tell you that our hero was not for turning in that regard. Now, another reason for the strong influence, or interest, I should say, in geology was because many of the new insights in geology seemed to be at odds with the Bible's narrative on creation. And at the time, in the early 19th century, most geologists were practicing Christians and so were anxious to shoehorn Earth's history into a biblical time frame. And of course, it was Archbishop Ussher in an earlier century who had determined that that time scale should be around about 6,000 years. Now, Usher actually gets a fair bit of unfair criticism, I think, for this these days, because actually, you know, it was remarkable scholarship for his day, and I would say that even if he wasn't a dub. But leaving that to one side, to account for the short time scale, geologists adopted the notion of catastrophism. That was the theory which said that the Earth's surface was shaped by periodic disasters, convulsions, separated by quiet periods. And of course, the most recent disaster or catastrophe would have been the deluge. Now, this jumble of rock and clay that we know as boulder clay, at that stage was interpreted as having been deposited from some kind of global flood, the kind, you see, that might correspond with Noah's flood. And remember, it was only in the later 19th century that most geologists interpreted this boulder clay as the product of regional ice sheets. But I have to say that catastrophism was already under attack at the end of the 18th century from the Scottish geologist James Hutton and his theory of the Earth. And this theory considered that the Earth's surface was molded by currently observable processes, but acting over an impossibly long period of time, endless cycles of erosion and deposition. Now, the whole theory would eventually be baptized with the unwieldy name of uniformitarianism, and its mantra was no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. You can understand that it took quite some time for this to gain a good bit of traction, and some of the early resistance was on religious grounds, because of course it envisaged a much vaster time scale than our Archbishop Usher would have allowed. But of course, over the succeeding few decades, the evidence in its failure did accumulate, and I have to tell you, by the end of Weaver's career, he was still a kind of a stubborn dissenter from the now pervasive uniformitarianism. But all was not black and white in this case. Now, scientific theories are valid only as long as they're not undermined by new evidence. And of course, we know these days there's been a partial revival of catastrophism. For example, we recognize that life on Earth has been extensively extinguished on a few occasions through Earth's history. Once, when the dinosaurs and their associates were wiped out by a comet or a large meteor striking the Earth. But there were earlier extinctions caused by catastrophic volcanism. Now, be that as it may, by the early 1820s, Weaver was living back at home in Gloucestershire, where he was happily involved in geological mapping. And, you know, actually both Griffith and himself shared the idea that when they weren't doing engineering work like mining, they were involved in geological mapping, and very often they were doing the two together. But anyway, he was happily mapping away when in 1824, there was a mining boom driven by a huge increase in demand for metals. And it coincided in Ireland with widespread famine, disastrous famine. And Weaver returned to Ireland to work with the Hibernian Mining Company. And himself and several other engineers were committed to developing mines wherever they could across Ireland, actually with the hope of relieving some of this distress. Now, among the other engineers involved were his old rival, Richard Griffith, but there was also Alexander Nimmo, a man who was very fondly remembered these days in Connemara, not for his mining, but for his development of roads and bridges and harbours, which became so important for the future of the region. However, as far as mining was concerned, of course, Weaver was the most experienced of them all, and he worked in many, many places around the country. He assessed something like 30 different lead prospects, and he lived in Killarney for several years as he attempted to develop a mine here at Ross Island on the shores of the lakes of Killarney. And of course, this is actually one of the most celebrated mines in Ireland, because it was here that the first copper ore was mined and smelted in the Bronze Age about 4,500 years ago. However, despite the richness of the ore and Weaver's best endeavours, unfortunately, its precarious lakeshore position made it impossible to work successfully. So Weaver did sadly leave Killarney, and indeed he left Ireland. And for much of the 1830s, he resided in Mexico, where he was involved in silver mining, a phase of his life that sadly we know very little about. But we do know that he returned to Europe and settled in London, where he retired around about 1840. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, because all this time, Weaver continued to undertake geological mapping. And in 1830, he had completed a study of the south of Ireland, and the map and report he submitted for publication to the prestigious Geological Society of London, the key geological body where his earlier work had been published. Now, while that had been widely praised, alas, this product met with some criticism during refereeing. And now we'll see in a moment that his views on the usefulness of fossils were quite controversial, but also there were difficulties with the way he treated coal seams. Now, coal seams occur in Carboniferous sequences in many parts of Ireland. In most areas, they're relatively undeformed, but the area he was dealing with down in the southwest, down there, the coal seams had been deformed by the Variscan orogeny. Now, this was something that Weaver hadn't appreciated, and he may have confused that period of deformation with the earlier one that he was familiar with over in Southeast Ireland, which we would now call the Caledonian. As a result of which, anyway, he thought the coal seams down in Cork and Limerick were much earlier than Carboniferous, and in the refereeing this was criticised. Now, when the error was pointed out, when this was pointed out to him, he went and did some field checking, saw his error, corrected it, and he received much merited praise as a result. Of course, his paper should then have been immediately published, in fairness, but of course there were one or two problems still, and one of them was distinctly personal, and that was this map here, which is Richard Griffith's geological map of Ireland. Now, this had now been in preparation by Griffith for over 20 years, and he was jumping at the bit to get it published at an important conference that was coming up. And it is just possible, in human terms, that he would have been unhappy to see Weaver's very extensive map published ahead of his. It just might have taken the shine of his own very fine achievement. And so, to me, it's alarming in ethical terms that Griffith was allowed to play a refereeing role in assessing Weaver's work, as a result of which Griffith's map, this map, did appear first, and to much acclaim, and well-deserved acclaim, whereas Weaver's map was delayed by several years, and when it did get published, it was to much less applause. And this is just a little reminder that, you know, science can be an imperfect pursuit at times, and we shouldn't forget that. Now, at that time in the early part of the 19th century and earlier, the Earth's crust was regarded as consisting of sedimentary beds, such as we see on the right here, and they were overlying deeper metamorphic and igneous rocks. This kind we see there, the highly deformed schists there we see on the lower left-hand side. And this succession was a simplistic expression of an Earth history, of a history of the Earth. But of course, during the 19th century, a much more sophisticated system would be developed of time-bound systems with familiar names like Carboniferous and Jurassic. And they would become well established. And it was a fact that in many regions, a given system was characterized by a particular rock type. For example, here in Ireland, you know, limestone was synonymous and is with the Carboniferous. And here, of course, we see the cherished limestone pavements of the Burren. But of course, if you look on the issue on a more global scale, it's quite apparent and quite obvious that an enormous range of sediments could form at any one time, and that the composition of a rock was no reliable guide to its age. Clearly, a new system was needed, and that was devised by the great English surveyor William Smith, who established that you could determine the age of a rock stratum by the fossil content. Now, not just any fossils, but what he called characteristic fossils. They were fossils of short-lived fauna, and the shorter lived the fauna were, the more tightly and accurately you could constrain the age of the host sediment. Now the validity of this approach has been established long since, and you know, it's the basis of stratigraphy these days. And I should tell you, my daughter is a primary school teacher, and she tells me that before the pandemic, she held a lesson for her class based on the work of William Smith and his characteristic fossils. Now, you may not be surprised that present-day 8-year-olds have no difficulty with the concept of characteristic fossils, but wait for it. Our hero Weaver did entertain some doubts about this, and he wasn't alone. That's what I want to say very carefully. He wasn't alone in this. In fact, in the early 1830s, he became a minor participant in a major controversy on this, because you see, the majority of fossils are longer lived and don't have a value in dating the rocks, and he was pointing to that, as were some of the leaders of British geology. People like Lyell, Murchison, DeLuge were all caught up in this controversy. Indeed, the historian of science, Martin Rudwick, has written a delightful account of this, and if you wanted to delve into it, there is a summary of it in my book. But anyway, the point I should make is that in his later career, Weaver spent a lot of time doggedly assembling fossil evidence in a vain attempt to refute the validity of these characteristic fossils. And of course, his work should have been welcomed as the very descent that would validate the concept. But some of his colleagues were just irritated with him for not adopting the new insights and new geological insights. Now, in his mid-60s and in his retirement in London, Weaver was rather surprised to find that his reputation was assailed by the editor of this eminent journal, the Mining Journal. Not because of his mapping, but because of his mining. The editor's journal actually was blatantly anti-Irish in criticizing the alleged ignorance of Irish shareholders and the alleged pessimism of Irish geologists. And he particularly singled out Weaver, even though Weaver, of course, wasn't Irish and he hadn't worked in Ireland for more than a decade. Now, the editor claimed that Weaver had made some inaccurate and pessimistic judgments. And those allegations were ill-founded, they were cantankerous, they were the kind that would attract litigation these days. Now, Weaver replied comprehensively to them, but those complaints, allied with earlier geological criticisms, really did damage his reputation. And for many people, it was a case of no smoke without fire. I think that that was a sad period in his life, but he did manage to continue to write geological papers, and he arranged for his valuable geological collections to be placed in geological museums, suitable museums. He was an engaging and considerate personality. He was the kind of man you would find him enthusiastically engaging in a ploughing contest in Wicklow, as I have said on other occasions, just as much as he would engage in a scholarly debate in London. He remained a single man throughout his life. Could he have been gay? Well, we've no evidence one way or the other, but he suffered ill health later in the late 1830s, and that ill health kind of dogged his final years, sadly. And following his death in 1855, he did attract some obituary notices, but really his contributions were fairly quickly forgotten. Now, England has managed to cherish his memory better than Ireland, because he is commemorated in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, whereas he doesn't get a mention in the Dictionary of Irish Biography. And here I am asserting him as Ireland's first economic geologist. Do you think there are any serious challengers to him in that regard? Tell me if you do. So how do I think of how do I reflect on Weaver's career? Well, I think his mine operations show him to have been a man with a strong social conscience. I think of him as a true scientist. He was occasionally or periodically wrong-headed, I will admit, but he championed the use of evidence at a time when that wasn't universal. And many of his peers chose to focus on his wrong-headedness and alone, and ignored his contributions. And of course, we know from the current climate change debate that there can be an alarming intolerance for that very dissent that should be used to validate emerging concepts. And it was Karl Popper who said that anyone refusing to expose ideas to the hazard of refutation is not in the scientific game. And I think that charge just might be leveled at some of his opponents, but he was marginalized as a result. And his reputation hasn't recovered since his 1855 death. And I do think it's now timely to review his career. I believe he led an interesting life that's worth telling, and I hope you agree. And even if you don't agree, I want to thank you for your attention this evening, and thank you very much.